Good afternoon. Norwalk Public Library presents the Indie and Local Authors Celebration. And this program is fiction, making it all up. So please.
Well, hello everybody. We've got four very different authors today who are going to talk about their books, how they happened, how they got them published, and what they're hoping to see from the publication of their books. So let's start over here with Michelle Herman. Michelle, tell us something about your book and how you got it published, what the publishing route was for you.
Okay. My novel is called Save the Village. It's literary fiction. I'm a writing teacher and have been for many years, so I like to say this is my second novel, but I didn't write the first one because it's not at all autobiographical. I made everybody up out of whole cloth. To give you a tiny bit of history about me, I grew up as far away from here as you can get and still be in Norwalk. I grew up in the last house on the last street in town off of Chestnut Hill. I moved to the village in the 80s with my now husband, who was my boyfriend then, and got to live in the thick of things instead of on the very edge of town. So I always knew if I was going to write a novel, it was going to be a Greenwich Village novel. It was going to be a love letter to my adopted neighborhood. So that's what I did. It took me a very long time to work out how to do the thing. And then in terms of getting it published, I spent some time looking for an agent, coming very close a bunch of times. I'm an alum of Columbia. I have an MFA from there that entitled me to go to their annual agents mixer, which was the most terrifying event you can imagine. It was horrible, but it was invaluable. I got much better at the whole process. In the end, I went directly to the publisher who ended up publishing it without an agent. Regal House, a small up-and-coming independent publishing house out of Raleigh, North Carolina. And the publisher herself, who's this dynamo from New Zealand, said, I'm very interested in pitching your story to my staff at our next meeting. I need you to fill out this very extensive questionnaire. Take time with it, do a good job. And it became clear to me that a lot of the questionnaire was aimed at determining whether I was going to be a good advocate for the book, because they're tiny, they have no publicity staff. So then I had to wait that terrible month until that meeting happened, and it took another week after the meeting, and then I got the yes. And then it was a 2-year process of, all the stuff that has to happen behind the scenes to make a book a real thing.
That's interesting because this morning we had an author who has sent his book to our local publishers, Woodhall Press, but sent it a week after they had their quarterly marketing meeting, the one at which they stand up for the books they want to publish and decide finally on who's going to do it. So he's got to wait till the end of December to hear.
Oh.
Yeah, right. Bit of a shame. Anyway, Barbara King has published 2 books. Tell us about your latest.
This is The Apple King, and there was no question that I was going to independently publish it because I had already done it once, and it was pretty simple. And I also wanted to get the book out quickly because the first 2 books that I wrote have to do with history in my hometown, and I wanted to make sure that it got out to the people, in a timely fashion before some of these people who might remember or be touched by these stories had passed on, quite frankly, and some of my biggest fans are, approaching 90, so they remember a lot of these things. But The Apple King is the story of a Croatian immigrant who made his fortune in California's apple industry and used his influence to help win freedom for his homeland. And again, my hometown of Watsonville, California, the Croatians developed it into the apple capital of the world for most of the 20th century. Apples have been grown there for quite a while, But these people, what they weren't so much apple growers as they were marketers and packers. And if you realize some of the things that they had to go through, being not only immigrants but uneducated, having to learn a very different language, and they had to do things like get the trains to do a different schedule. It was almost impossible what they had to go through in order to build this business. But this was a book I never thought about writing, but I had gone out to my hometown for a book signing on my first book, The California Immigrant. And in the course of being there, a woman came in and she said, "Have you heard of this book?" And I hadn't, so she pulled it from the bookshelf and started going through it and then left. And when I finished my book signing, it was still there. I decided, why not? I'll buy it. When I started going through it, I could see this story of Croatians in our valley, which is called Pajaro Valley. And we're not next to Salinas, Santa Cruz County, Monterey, on the Monterey Bay. That is the location. And and then I discovered that a couple of very prominent, patriarchs of the Croatian community were my great-great-uncles. And one of them brought my grandmother over. So then it became even more like, and then I looked at one of them and I was, oh my God, my older son just has a striking resemblance. And so I just really felt very committed to writing the story after that. So I had this book and I went through it, and then I called one of the authors, and she led me on to another another sort of a book that had been put together for an anniversary. It was over 20 years of newspaper clippings from our hometown that involved Croatians. And so a lot of them, a lot of births, deaths, and so forth. But there were some real gems in there about the history that had gone on and things that I certainly didn't know. So between the two books, and then we're talking about fiction, and this book couldn't have, even though it's historical, it couldn't have been written as nonfiction because I didn't have enough information. I couldn't interview people. So there are a lot of things I had to make up. But when you have enough real history tidbits, your imagination can really fill in the gaps. At least it did in my case.
That's so cool. So historical fiction. Nan, tell us about your latest book.
So this is my 10th contemporary fiction novel, my third with Harper Perennial, and it's the third in a series, A Good Measure. It's inspired by a verse from the Bible, "For the good Lord above," hang on a second. It's from Luke chapter 6, verse 38. "Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For all the measure you use, it will be measured to you." And the book is inspired by a group of widows in the town where I live. They call themselves the Guild, and they meet every Thursday night, and they drink wine and have dinner and support each other in their loss. I think they get together even more than on Thursday. And they're a very fun group. And so the main character in this story is a new widow. She's a mother of 6 sons. Her youngest is 28, and she's very worried about him. And 2 of her best friends are widows in the group, and they each have children who are 28. So these 3 grew up together and were friends, and each of the kids has something going on in their lives that worries their mom. Their moms are prayerful and hoping for the best for their child. So any mom can relate to, the worries they have for their kids. And my stories, all my books have a thread of faith and family. I'll have a pet or some animals in them. My goal is always to write an uplifting story with a thread of faith and write about things that other moms, anyone really can relate to. So maybe perhaps when they are going through something, they don't feel so alone.
So one of the things I found was interesting about Nan's book was that this new widow wasn't at all keen to join the guild to begin with. And I thought that was fascinating because these were two of her close friends, but she was very resistant. And the other thing I found was interesting was the setting of this book, because right now we've got New York, we've got California, Northern California, and we've got either a tiny town or a rural town, am I right? In Tennessee. So we're covering the waterfront here. Luca, tell us something about your book, what it's about, how it got written.
Greenhaven is about a director of nursing, Kathy Arden, who works in an upscale nursing home. And like we all are when we first start out in our career, she's gung-ho and ready to change the world through nursing. And what happens is through a series of events that happen very, very quickly at the nursing home, she becomes disenchanted and is an ostrich sticking her head in the sand. She starts to realize that there's an alarming number of patients dying in the nursing home and starts to investigate it. And the further she digs into it, she finds out she's being framed for the murders. I, by nature, am quirky and like to laugh and have fun. So there is some quirkiness in the book. She lives alone. She likes to watch detective shows. And so she uses her knowledge from these shows to try and solve the mystery. Some work, some don't. But it's a very real instance that's going on. And she has to really fight for her life here or she's going to end up in prison. There's a Detective Oakes who's grumpy and old, and he is after her, and he is believing she's done it, and he's not going to stop till he catches her. She has to prove him wrong. And in time, she has to also find the villain before she gets caught. The book actually has two other storylines that are running simultaneously that help leave clues as to who the murderer is. And I have challenged people to find it before they get to the chapter that reveals it. And it's been fun to get the emails and from people saying, I think it's this or it's that, or why did you do that? You know, like if someone died or something like that. So my background was I was a podiatrist for 28 years, and for health reasons retired. And I've always loved to write. Even when I first started my medical career, I wrote a column for a local paper called Foot Chat. And, yeah, it sounds funny now, I know. Did that for a while. Wrote for a couple of websites. And so writing Greenhaven, a story about an upscale nursing home, was right up my alley because I saw a lot of patients in nursing homes. And in one line in the book, I write that Greenhaven is a place for the rich and the forgotten. And I had serviced a lot of patients, a lot of residents in nursing homes. And when I came to notice is sometimes I might be the only outside person other than staff they see for weeks on end. And I attribute it to, like, if you've ever owned a boat or a motorcycle or something like that, when you first get it, you use it every weekend, you take care of it, stuff like that. As time goes on, it's every other weekend. Well, this happens a lot with family members in nursing facilities. You go and see them, and then it gets a little less and a little less, and the weeks seem to go by. I'm not disparaging the family members because it's difficult to see your loved one in that state and go and take care of them. You do it out of love, but it plays a number on you. And Kathy becomes very close to some of the patients, even confides in them. But she's become, like the people visiting, she's become hardened to it because of what happens in her own life. And this whole awakening of this serial killings brings her back into the world and awakens her. She's that ostrich who's lifting her head out of the sand because of it.
So this is fascinating. Where does it take place?
It takes place in a mid-sized city anywhere USA.
Okay, so we've widened our perspective. What made you think of that as a topic for your thriller?
I get that question a lot, and the funny thing is, it just came to me at night. People ask me, you know, why do you write the way you write? Well, I write a lot of dialogue, and I tell people, I'm not really a writer, I just take dictation, okay? And the characters are talking to me, and I'm writing it down. And when the story is done and I'm going back to edit, I tell people, that's where the characters start telling me where I wrote it down wrong, and I have to rewrite. Editors have been telling me that too, but anyway. Yeah, for me, it's like I'm listening to another person talk, and I'm just writing as fast as I can. The storyline comes from people I have seen in the nursing homes, and the characters in here that are the residents are more of a blend
Okay.
of patients that I've known throughout the 28 years.
That's cool. So, Michelle, what made you write this book and with the characters that it has, and was there something in particular that nudged you towards it?
There were many things. So, becoming a villager, something I never expected to do. I used to go to the village with my friends on a weekend and go see a show and ogle everything. So then I got to be a villager, and I just fell in love with the neighborhood history. And we live in the far west village, which is still a little brick enclave, 19th century enclave, and I even fell in love with the brick. I published an essay about the history of Hudson River brick. And the villagers, we got very active in a lot of local preservation organizations early on. We even, we were brainstorming ideas for a fundraiser with one of the groups that we joined, which was called Save the Village. And I said, well, I'll write a letter to Pete Seeger and see if he'll come and do a fundraiser. And Pete Seeger wrote back and said, sure. So we organized this Pete Seeger concert. So we were living in and among these old-time villagers who were fighting the good fight to try to preserve the neighborhood. So I wanted to write a novel that honored those people that I came to know and love, who were very different from the people I knew growing up. So I created my main character. Her name is Becca Kameyer, and she's a tour guide. She's a lifelong fifth-floor tenement resident, barely earning a living. You know, she's in her 50s. She's still working on the street. Not a good arrangement. And so we meet Becca on a beautiful autumn night where she's giving a tour to 6 women from South Carolina, tour the village. They fall in love with the village, which is always what her goal is. And then something terrible happens that night in Washington Square. And so the whole thing takes place in the week after, and it's in 2006. I purposely said it then. I wanted it to be a few years after 9/11, when it still felt very fresh and people still were kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. So it's now becoming more and more historical, right? As you know, who knew that political events were going to accelerate to such a degree and become so outrageous that 2006 would seem quaint. And so she's my prototypical old-time villager. I've got my prototypical yuppie scum villager, who's her arch enemy, who used to be her very best friend. One of the many threads of the plot involves the two of them finding their way back to each other, which I guess is something I've always loved in movies and TV, when you have 2 sworn enemies, and you kind of sense that that's going to change. But how do you make it happen so that it's plausible? So that was a lot of fun, that subplot. But there's many other characters and many subplots going on as well. So
it sounds like you love the old schoolness of the village. Did you ever consider writing a historical novel?
yeah, this is maybe as close as I'll get since
Recent history.
well, but she's also giving a tour in the first chapter that's, a tour of history. And I was talking to somebody or other along the way. I've done many interviews, and somebody posited the idea that writing the book itself is in a kind of an act of preservation.
Yes.
So I feel as if maybe that's my historical contribution, just to show people this is what villagers have been like, and this is what's being lost, this is what remains.
So that's a little similar to your books, isn't it, Barbara? And you explained how you sort of came across the story, but how did you turn it into fiction from the non-fiction books that inspired you?
Well, one was really not a real book. I mean, it was a historical, and they had little articles and pictures and things like that. The other one was just newspaper clippings.
Oh.
And they were organized in chronological order. There was an index, so like if you wanted to look up, World War I or something, you could see some articles, you could find those articles. But, I really didn't have a real story. I had to, again, like Luke had mentioned, I love to do dialogue. So once I can get my characters talking, they're constantly talking. They're talking, when I'm cooking, they're talking when I'm in the bathroom getting dressed, they're talking, they're always talking, and then I can write, and it can be like taking dictation, almost. And then, unfortunately, you have to do some filling in amongst the dialogue afterwards.
So was the Apple King, who I assume is the main character,
Yes.
was he a real person or based on a real person?
Yeah, more or less. Once I discovered I had these two great uncles, and one was like the first to come over, I kind of looked at him. I always had him in mind, but because there were a lot of other Croatians involved in the community who were involved in the apple industry, I didn't want it to just be pegged, they have to think, oh, what about my uncle, or, my uncle, I wanted it to be a little more universal, so I didn't want it to be so obvious. It was just about him. But the interesting thing is, there were several brothers that came over, and they were all from generally the same area over just outside of Dubrovnik. And so it was, I learned a lot about my hometown. Some of you, if you grew up in a hometown, you might have said, nothing ever happened here. That's how we sort of grew up. And then when I wrote my first book, which Where Flowers Grow, which I published third, I had a lot of historical information left over. And I was also going on a trip to Croatia. And I said, this could be another novel, but I wasn't sure how to get into it. And then once I was over there, I was like, oh, okay, a Croatian immigrant, loosely based on my grandfather. I mean, he isn't really it wasn't really, but it was a way to get started. And, I used quite a few details. But my hometown during World War II was one of the few that had an airport on the West Coast. So the Navy took it over, taught dive bombing, sent flyers out to the Pacific Theater. They also patrolled the coast. We also had one of the largest Japanese towns because it's a very agricultural area. So, I really kind of focused a lot on the whole Japanese thing. And when I was growing up, many of my friends were Japanese, and I never knew about any of this. No one talked about this. I didn't find out about this until really close to college years. It wasn't taught in the schools. It wasn't spoken about. We went to Japanese festivals at the Buddhist temple, but no one ever spoke about what happened. And so it was all very personal to me when I wrote the first book.
Sure, interesting. And then this book of yours, I know you mentioned that you have a thing called the Guild in your town. First of all, this is a town in Tennessee, so what made you pick Tennessee? And
Well, the series is
it's a
Savannah.
series, right?
Yes, the Savannah Sky series. So the first two primarily set in Savannah, Georgia, but one of the characters came from near Knoxville and lived on a farm. So that's how I sort of gravitated westward a bit. And,
But you made up this character, so
Yeah.
what made you put her in Knoxville or him?
well, so in the second book, Promises to Keep, the main character, nursing home, not really a nursing home, more of a retirement place, so a lot of, could relate to that. But her significant other was from this farm on Tennessee where he was one of 6 boys. And so and his father died in the book. So that's how, the third book was to be about his mother, who was the widow. And that's how it happened.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Has anybody else here, or is anybody else here writing a series?
Not so far.
Not so far. Yours is a little bit, is it?
Well, it's kind of a series. They're all
theme.
standalone books, but they all take place at different times in our town, and they involve a little bit different industries. The first book had a lot to, or my first book that I published, California Immigrant, had a lot to do with the strawberry business, which has now surpassed the apples. The apples are no longer as important. And then, of course, the apple business, and then the flower business, which is where flowers grow. So I did kind of focus on that. And then, you know, you get a lot of different immigrant people. You have the Japanese, you have the Mexicans, there were Chinese there. There was a Chinese town in the early years. So the agriculture really drew a lot of different people. In fact, I got a real laugh out of this when in this period of time, in this book, when it was harvest time, a lot of different people came to town, and they would be on Main Street, you know, after they had done their, you know, picking of apples or whatever, and the people thought it was they created a cosmopolitan atmosphere, you know, in their work clothes, and, you know, I could just imagine, but they thought it was cosmopolitan because they heard different languages and accents and so forth, and they really appreciated that atmosphere in town.
That's so cool. So, Luca, this is your first book?
This is my first novel.
Your first novel. So my question is, you mentioned a grumpy police officer.
Yes.
Is this a character that might recur in
It-
another book?
It's funny you're asking that because my first intention was Greenhaven was going to be a standalone. And I've gotten a lot of requests for a sequel. And yes, the grumpy police officer is probably going to be the main character in the new book. It's not yet ready to be talked about.
Not for prime time?
No, but you asked about a series. Quick funny story. I got asked to write a short story. And I started writing this detective humor story, totally out of the genre I usually write in. And after stopping, it was 20,000 words for a 5,000 word short story.
Oh.
So I decided to keep going with it, and that one is now about 70,000 words. And there are 2 more in the works behind that. So that one's been a lot of fun, and it's about an older woman who goes back to work for a private detective who can't solve cases, and she solves them on her lunchtime.
Yeah, we understand that. That sounds like you've got a great market for that.
So it was a lot of fun. But Greenhaven won't have one, but I have 3 in the working before it, so.
Right. So when you're writing these, do you have an audience in mind for the books?
You know, I start out that way, but then it kind of becomes organic and it takes on its own life, and I just have to let it run. And I get a problem. Greenhaven, when it was first written, was 104,000 words, and in its final cut down was 98,000. And you just have to start stripping down all the stuff that doesn't carry the story. But 38 revisions later, and this is what came out of it.
So if you had to imagine your ideal reader, who would it be?
For Greenhaven,
Hmm.
I'd say it's for somebody who, professionals will probably like it, just out of their curiosity. But I think it's also for people who might feel stuck and need a kickstart to get themselves going again. And that's why I use the ostrich in the sand metaphor, because that's what Kathy was. She was an ostrich with her head in the sand. And there's actually a couple of other characters that still portray that type of image and grow into their own self with the other two stories.
How about you, Nan? Do you have an audience in mind when you're writing, or do you know who your likely audience is? Or do you know who reads your books?
I think that mostly women read my books, but I think that men would also enjoy them. And so I guess, I don't know if I think about who's going to read it.
It's interesting because I was previously talking to people who had written memoirs, and every one of us was surprised by the people who ended up reading our books. We thought they'd be largely for people our own age. And Sharon Duquette, who wrote a story about how she ran away to, not a story, her life, about how she ran away to join the hippies, was quite surprised to find that 20 and 30-year-old young women were fascinated, partly because they had felt like running away, but also because the history of the hippies is, as I joked, but half true, has moved to Vermont. And the hippie culture is no longer an everyday kind of thing, so they were interested in the historical aspect of it. So those readers surprised us all. So I was wondering whether, for example, do you know who either your ideal reader is, or who is actually reading your book?
I have a wide network of people I know, so I'm hoping they're all reading the book, and I'm hoping it's getting beyond the people that I know. In terms of picturing a reader, I thought a whole lot about people who are New Yorkers and people who are not New Yorkers, and I wanted
Who would
very
like to
much
be.
who would like to be, or who are intimidated by people who live in the big city. And so I didn't want the book to be off-putting in any way to any of them. I wanted it seems to be fairly universal, and I hoped that they would resonate with anybody in any town USA that's bumping up against gentrification in any form, because that's what Becca is also bumping up against, being the old guard. So I have these 6 women, these wives from South Carolina, who take the tour in the beginning, and the point of view in the beginning goes back and forth between their collective point of view and Becca's point of view, and it took me a really long time to work out how that was going to operate. Nobody can hold in their head 6 different characters, so I had to be very careful to give a little ID each time for each of these tourist women. And there's a line early in the book that a friend of mine in the writing world told me he liked a lot, where I have the women sort of collectively say, well, what if New York turned out to be a test that they might fail, and the failure would go on their permanent record? And that's sort of the way I felt as a kid going into the big city. My family would take us there, and it felt very alien. And I never thought that I might live there. So I wanted it to appeal to anybody. And then I guess the other thing I should talk about is I'm a writing teacher from way, way back. I started out as a high school English teacher. I love words and sentences, so it's a literary novel. I like imagery. I like things remind me of other things. I love making analogies, so I feel like the book is rich with that kind of immersive detail and language. So I like for each sentence to have something interesting going on in it.
So would it be fair to call it a love letter to Greenwich Village?
Oh, very much so,
There you
yes.
Your elevator pitch, you're welcome. So your readers, I seem to remember, Barbara's a member of a writing group that I run around here, and your first book, I seem to remember you talking about your audience being the descendants of Croatian people living in your own hometown. Is that still true of the other books, and do you think of them when you're writing your books?
Yes, I think that my target audience is really those people, and, they might, some of them may have migrated out of younger generations could have left, but, and it's surprisingly, when I get letters, it tends to be from men. And I do remember my father in his later years, he started reading more books, and, men do like to read more historical, and I think because of my writing, it's a little more, I'm not writing prose and all of that, so it's kind of a little more sparse that they might feel more comfortable reading.
And your main characters are men, right?
My main characters are men, yes. And so I have, and, some of these people have really appreciated, I'm not making a lot of money off these books, and that was not the reason, and I really need to figure out how to market them better, but I have to say, just hearing from one person that really gets something out of my book, that is really rewarding to me. I don't have to have 100,000 people buying my books, but, especially someone who has lived through it, people, their memories are coming back. There have been some book clubs out there with women that have read my book, and I did get feedback about, because with my first book, they had, had a lot of memories from that and had lived through that, and it just brought up all this stuff. So they have really appreciated it.
That's so cool. Well, I think we have time for a little bit of reading. Nan, would you like to read a couple of pages from your book?
Sure. Let's see. I'm gonna pick something random.
Pick a page, any page.
Sorry.
I shouldn't have put you on the spot like that.
Okay, so this is one of the moms, not the main mom, but the secondary main mom. Peyton wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, pulled a blanket up over her shoulders, and sank into the Adirondack chair on her back porch to watch the sunrise. She treasured the peacefulness of Sunday mornings. When she'd first opened the coffee bean, they'd been open 7 days a week, but her earnestness had lasted 6 months. She and Cash both needed a day off, and they picked Sunday. Cash called it Lazy Day. Even God took Sunday off after creating the world, she had told Ames, and the Bible says we are supposed to take it off too. You don't need to convince me. I'm all for you taking a day off. You deserve it. It's a rule people don't honor anymore. Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays, Ames reminded her. That's the only place. I remember when we were little, nothing was open except church. Every store in town was closed. If you were out of something, you were out of luck. People should go back to that. It would be good for their health and their sanity. They'd spend more time with their families, more time doing relaxing things like fishing, reading books and daydreaming, more time watching the clouds drift by. We need more cloud watching and less go, go, go.
Very nice, very nice. Now for something completely different, I suspect.
Okay, well, we'll give it a shot here. It was Thursday. Kathy had a quiet morning, only being belittled by Kyle in the morning report. This was about an hour each day that Kyle took pleasure in showing the Greenhaven world how he was great. She returned to her office to continue with her reviews of whatever needed her attention. She enjoyed the solitude after all these years. 11:52 a.m. Kathy almost cringed hearing, Dr. Past, coming over the intercom. This time it was the south wing. Kathy sighed as she reached into her desk, trying not to mar the new colored nail polish on her another suggestion from Greenhaven Inc.'s astute professional appearance ideal. She pulled out the form and started down the hallway. South Wing was a mirror unit housing 20 residents, all of whom could afford a long-term care with a private aide and an assistant. Kathy always thought it was like having a butler or a maid in a nursing facility. She figured the rich needed something to spend their money on. The families of the residents paid privately for everything and didn't ask questions. Greenhaven residents may have had all the amenities, but they were short on family. It's the common theme link among all of them here. Okay, Padre, it's time to go in and do some work, Kathy quipped as she passed the nurse's station. Kathy pushed back the arms of the hanging 24-inch television so she could get to the resident. Adam James was the managing partner of James Long McNeil and 7 other names on a huge wall of a firm downtown. Attorney James was 91 years old and had not practiced law in over 30 years. He retired early and lived with his entitled 4 children until they placed him here in Greenhaven at 81 years old. Adam was one of Kathy's oldest residents. She had known him since her first day, back when he was lively and spent most of his time at Greenhaven giving free legal advice to residents, as well as the staff. Kathy recalled having a conversation with the scholarly resident many years ago. Ever since a bad outcome here at Greenhaven, which I must admit was instigated by me, but I only had good intentions, I have you know. You're talking about the computer snafu. It's not a secret. He gave her a fatherly look. Yes, and ever since that, Carla has hated me and has given me subtle beatings on a daily basis. She put her head down slightly. Has anyone else been present for any of these beatings? I don't think so. I could come out of retirement and give him a few myself. That won't be necessary. Please don't say anything. At that moment, Kathy realized she had said too much.
Ooh, I'm getting worried already. Good. Michelle?
Sure. So this is, the whole novel, as I think I mentioned, takes place in the course of a week after this bomb goes off.
Oh.
And so that happens on Monday. This is Tuesday evening. The power is out in the village. And I'll just read the beginning of this chapter. It's called Ollie Ollie Oxenfree. Evening finally arrived, and everyone on Becca's block came out. The old commies with the berets and the onion roll breath, the artists in the ironically oversized polyester clothes from the West basement sale, and the young families with their titanium strollers, each the color of a different tropical fruit. The vegans came out with baba ganoush. At first, people stood or sat on the nearest stoops, but then a young enterprising dad brought down a shrink-wrapped pack of wood he bought for the weekend house and built a fire right in the street. Won't the cobblestones melt? Asked the kids who gathered round. Won't the fire spread? No one knew. This had never happened before. Becca smelled wood smoke from the 5th floor, looked out her window, grabbed her father's old army blanket, and ran down. Mindy, the super's wife, and Ed from next door scooted aside to make room. And for a little while at least, the old-timers almost forgot to resent the newcomers, and the newcomers decided that maybe the old-timers weren't quite so moth-bitten and pleased with themselves. We're like a page out of Jane Jacobs, said one of the hipsters. Food appeared like magic. Ears of Jersey corn from someone's freezer, chicken kebabs, a braided challah. In the middle was a stick of softening butter, and people were tearing off hunks of sweetbread and using the butter like dip. Becca placed her hands behind her on the cobblestones. She felt the sturdy surface of the granite that was said to have been brought from Europe as ship ballast, and in the spaces in between, she felt what might have been actual earth. And she had a strong sensation of sitting on her slowly spinning planet. The Jamaican babysitters who'd been invited to spend the night stood on the sidelines in their sensible heels and their tucked-in blouses. "Sing us a Jamaican song," said the young dads. "We've heard you sing lullabies. We know you sing like angels." But the good Christian nannies demurred, smiling at the very idea. The Maltese supers, with their tinkling accents, brought out a bocce set and gathered around with the Ecuadorians and the Mexicans. And then, when no one was watching, the Jamaican nannies conferred. They spread out in a line across the street, softly swung their hips in unison, and sang a song with a refrain like small waves lapping Caribbean sand.
coming down with a bunch of roses coming down.
Everyone joined in. I'll stop there.
Oh, we all want to go now, don't we? We all want to be there. So, yes, let's hear about the apple.
Well, I mentioned that one of the things after my character made his fortune in apples, he got involved in pursuing the freedom for his homeland. And part of that was there were actual representatives from London committees, Washington committees, coming to my small agricultural town to meet with these people and get them, you know, and get their support and of course their money probably too. But, and when I read all these things, I'm thinking, well, this is probably going on here today too in different ethnic communities and with things going on around the world. There are these committees and representatives coming to, well, or, you know, lots of different places. But anyway, the situation over in Austria doesn't look good, Nick said. I can't believe the Crown suspended the Croatian constitution over a little complaint. And now it seems there will be war in the Balkans, Frank said. And Frank is his brother. It's like Dr. Vidmar warned. The Austrians are looking for a way to start a war to put an end to pan-Slavism. Are you going to San Francisco on Tuesday to discuss fundraising for the Balkan War? Wouldn't dare miss it. Besides, it will give me another chance to touch base with Dr. Vidmar. I want to offer my services. The meeting on October 15th was about more than fundraising. 40,000 Croatians in the state had organized themselves into the Croatian League with the goal of winning independence for Croatia. The plan was to send fighters to the country to join their brethren in the cause. Timing would depend on the Balkan War. Balkan League countries of Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece had banded together to drive the Turks out of Europe. Croatians knew war would occupy Austrians' attention, and they intended to take advantage of that opportunity. Bay Area men from Balkan League countries readied themselves to depart in a few days, and as soon as war was declared, Croatian men would follow to their own battle. Nick pulled Dr. Vidmar aside to have a word with him. How can I help you in this effort? First, I'm sure you understand that the War of Independence has to be kept quiet, and in my position, he worked for the embassy, they could try me for treason, of course. That being said, men and money will be required through our network. I will get you the specifics. You can count on me. But for now, we all need to appear to be focused on the Balkan War, and it is important to us too. Austria and Germany have a Middle Europa plan to squash the Slavs. They know Russia will not hesitate to step in to protect their Slav brothers, and once they do, that will open the door to all-out war. Ultimately, they plan to partition Russia among themselves. I don't understand. They've done it before. Remember Poland? They partitioned that Slav country right off the map. Nick was speechless. All this was too much to process. Vidmar caught his astonishment. Now maybe you understand what we're up against. Our very identity is at stake.
Very cool. I want to thank all the authors for reading that, but before we give them a round of applause, I'm wondering if there are any questions from the audience for any of us. Yes?
Yeah, I came yesterday also, and I've been talking with the writers. They're very, very interesting stories, you know, it's amazing. And it's well organized. My question is, you know, maybe the same question. You learn a lot by writing stories, everything, especially the second lady. What's her name?
Barbara?
Barbara, yeah, it seems interesting, the book. And I talk with some other people too. My question is, well, what are you doing in order to reach the increasing population, Spanish, to get across these books or these messages? Because acculturation is extremely important for the people. And maybe reaching to the increasing population of Spanish, they can learn about the culture, especially the American culture. If they're supposed to learn English or not, or what's going on and stuff. There's interesting stories, right? Are you doing anything to reach that kind of population? Even if the library is making the effort to attract this author? I don't see any Spanish author over there
So
outside.
are you asking whether any of our authors here have thought about translating their books into Spanish for the Hispanic community?
Yeah, that would be for translate maybe, but are you reaching some, do you have an association or are you reaching that kind of people so they can come and?
Well, I have a memoir, which is not fiction, but I have been asked whether I'm going to translate it so that it's available for people to read in Spanish. My own problem with it is that it's expensive to do that, but also I speak Spanish, but my Spanish is not good enough to know whether a translation is a good translation. So what that means is that the big publishers know the good translators, but there are some books I've read that have been translated from Spanish or French to English and from Italian, and I have not liked the English version because it sounds like a translation. When you have a good translator, it sounds like a book that's been written in that language. So it's a difficult issue, but I don't know whether anybody here has either thought about it or had anything translated.
I've had books translated and lots of different languages, but it's been when another country, a publisher in another country, has bought the subrights to my book and done the translation and then published the book for that country. So for
So
an
they're
author,
asking to do it
Right.
rather than the author. Yeah.
I wanted to mention, we're here for Indie Author Day, which is sponsored by the Indie Author Project, and they have a contest that they've been running for the last few years. And last year, this book won the Connecticut Indie Author Project. So, and that also came with, a cash award, which now they've actually increased for this year going forward. They also have an opportunity. My first book, The California Immigrant, I submitted to the contest, but it did not win. And I had entered a couple of contests just because I thought, well, who knows whose eyes are going to be on this book? Maybe something will come out of it, even if I don't win. And quite a few months later, I got invited into their library program for Overdrive, which it's a curated program, and they select indie books and indie ebooks for Overdrive, which is a library lending program you can use on the Libby app. And it's actually a really good way to read inexpensively if you like to read with ebooks. So anyway, my first book got invited into it, and even before this one was selected, I asked if I could submit a book, and you can, even if your book has not won awards. If you have an indie book, you can submit to them. There's a place online under the authors section to submit. And I also want to mention, I recently listened to a interview by a national indie author winner from a few years ago, and he has found this ebook program to be very profitable, and he works with libraries, and he also tends to submit his book first to the libraries before he publishes on a platform like Amazon or something else.
Okay, thank you for that. We have to wind up now because there are more people coming to talk to you, but I would like to thank our authors, Michelle Herman, Barbara King, Nan Rossiter, and Luca Di Matteo for coming today and sharing their books with us. And you can find out more about them on all their websites or by checking back with the Norwalk Library, which will be happy to give you more information about them. Thank you.
Thank you all. And especially thank you, Gary Coatsworth, who has been the supreme moderator for us for the past 2 days, so thank you.